Do the roll call, please.
Mrs. Avery?
Here.
Mr. Hetty?
I'm here.
Mrs. Chandler?
Here.
Mr. Courteau?
Here.
Chairman Dake?
Here. Please stand for the pledge and join us. Mr. Hetty will lead us in the pledge. Thank you.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Hetty. Number 3, approval of the minutes. Has everybody had a chance to take a look at our minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Do I have a second? I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Passes. Number 4 moves us right to public comment. If we have anyone from the public that would like to come up and speak, please state your name and your address for the record. Thank you very much. Step forward, sir.
My name is Tom Gruber. My address is 221 F Park Shores Circle in Indian River Shores. And as I've mentioned before, I have 6 to 7 years experience with a hornless rail system up north in the Boston area, both during permitting and during construction. And I've put together some of my thoughts, which you may find useful, so here goes. Again, this is just my own personal thoughts, but let's start out talking about grade crossings. For a hornless system, everybody seems to be preoccupied with quad gates, and that's not a necessity. An option is a channelized crossing. And a channelized crossing consists of a 2-gate crossing, each gate positioned to stop the vehicles from entering the crossing, and a barrier strip perpendicular to the rail between opposing lanes of traffic. And the purpose of that is that once a car is caught in the channel, it can't do a U-turn and go around the gates. And in our particular town, we had 9 crossings, and we have only 1 quad crossing. 2 are private crossings, which is a single lane, and then the balance are channelized crossings. So that's something that you need to consider. And certainly channelized crossings are far, far, far less expensive than a quad gate. And for example, in Vero Beach, the 19th Street crossing would be a perfect example for a channelized crossing application, where you could use adequate room for barrier strips on either side to separate the traffic. So when the gate comes down, you'd literally trap the cars in the channels. And crossings with one-way traffic probably don't need quad gates. I mean, you just have a single gate, and that's adequate for closing the crossing. After reflection, if you stretch this a bit, it might be possible, even though it's a long shot, to use a modified channelized crossing on sites such as Aviation Boulevard. By a modified channelized crossing, I mean that the airport side of the crossing could be a channelized design. The Route 1 side would contain a substantial barrier from the track to the edge of Route 1. It's possible, even though the barrier will be short, that Route 1 itself makes it unlikely that a vehicle can reverse and go around the barrier. According to Google Maps, a rough estimate of the Aviation Boulevard shows the barrier would be about 20 feet long, and I don't know if that's adequate, but there are other things that can be used in addition to complement that might make it safe. In fact, whenever a signal-controlled intersection is near a crossing and feeds traffic to that crossing, that signal is usually tied into the railroad system, such as you'd have on the Route 1 side of Aviation Boulevard. And essentially what it does is it stops from feeding traffic into the rail crossing. The signal will give preference to the train over road vehicles and is used to prohibit feeding traffic into the crossing when the gates are down. This could also be an important part of a crossing, other crossings. So the upshot is the cost of crossings for a hornless system may be less costly than previously estimated if channelized crossings are used. Also, regardless of who pays for hornless crossings within their city limits, the city is responsible for a hornless permit from the FRA. That's something you need to think of. The design of the crossing will be scored by the FRA, and they have an online way of doing that, by way of a safety evaluation process, and a hornless permit will be granted or designed. So they have all kinds of safety factors they take into account and determine whether it can be hornless or not. In my opinion, the hornless crossing must be designed with the design cooperation of the railroad due to the detailed tie-ins required between the railroad communication and signaling systems. If you'd like to read the rules for hornless crossings, see the 103-page 49 CFR Parts 22 and 229, the use of locomotive horns at highway grade crossings, interim final rule dated 12/18/2003. That's about 103 pages. Now, that's what I want to say about crossings. I think there's some interesting things there that need to be considered. I suggest also the city need to take a step back for a minute and look at the overall situation. The railroad company has a mission to build the railroad as fast as it can at lowest possible cost so it can begin revenue service. That's their goal. As you have seen, any requests that don't fit within these parameters are summarily dismissed. This is not intended to be a criticism of the railroad's methods of operation. It's just a fact. The city has the mission to do the best job it can to protect its citizens, minimize the impacts on the residents' quality of life, while doing the best job to provide for their safety. Therefore, the railroad's mission and the city's mission are not necessarily the same. They're divergent. So how can some of these differences be resolved? Or to put it another way, how can the city obtain mitigation they feel is important but is being denied by the railroad? The answer lies in the railroad's environmental permitting process. The railroad must generate a draft EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, which is in compliance with the NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. So what must the railroad address in the EIS? And this is quoted from the railroad's website. Quote, NEPA is a decision-making process that requires federal agencies to consider the impacts of actions on the human and natural environment and to disclose such impacts in a public document. Over 30 categories are evaluated, including potential impacts to economic, social, cultural, environmental justice, noise, vibration, air quality, water quality, protected species, and essential habitats. So it's a very, very thorough investigation of the impacts. In addition, Section 106, which the train talks about in there under the EIS, requires that all railroad projects' impacts on historic resources must be identified and mitigated if necessary. Note, this applies not only to registered historic buildings and sites, but also to all eligible historic sites. This means if a site meets the criteria for registration but is not registered, it is still considered for the purpose of mitigation. Immediate sites of historic concern might be the old train station, the Vero Man site, the diesel generating plant, and so on. The Vero Beach Historic Preservation Commission, the Historical Society, the Florida State Historic Preservation Officer are all important resources for defining these sites and the mitigation they feel is important. In addition, the EIS the railroad must present reasons why this project should be constructed at all when compared to the no-build option or other options. That's part of the EIS. The upshot of all this is the EIS process is the final court, and that's in quotes, in which benefits of the rail project are weighed against all the impacts and the necessary mitigation is determined. This is a vitally important process to any city or town which will be impacted by the railroad project. The railroad on their website has set down a schedule for the EIS. The first scoping meetings were held in May of 2013. I think it was at 5 or 6 different locations. The draft EIS was due in September of 2013, so it's already 4 months plus late. The final EIS was scheduled for April 2014. And I can tell you from my experience up north, the EIS was a multiple-year endeavor and not multiple months. As can be seen, the railroad project is already 4 to 5 months behind the schedule for the draft document. Not until the draft EIS becomes a public document will anyone really know the details of the railroad's proposed design. From this point, the city will be able to see the design details and will be able to determine the impacts of what additional mitigation measures they feel are necessary for Vero Beach. So what should Vero Beach do? This is just my opinion. If you wish, do preliminary scoping work on crossing designs for hornless system with major consideration to defining the reason that Vero Beach needs a hornless system. After draft EIS is published, study the design and the rationale for the design in detail. Determine specific parts of the design that will need to be changed, in your opinion, to protect the citizens of Vero Beach, along with facts and figures, and by that I mean hard data, not just, well, we feel this and we feel that kind of stuff, which justify the changes requested. Participate very actively in the EIS and Section 106 hearings with the goal of improving the project on behalf of the citizens of Vero Beach. Given sufficient hard data and facts, some of the things that could possibly be considered in the EIS hearings are additional noise mitigation, fencing, hornless crossings, and possibly even a station stop on the Treasure Coast, possibly in Vero Beach. This would seem to be tough, but I believe a strong business case could be made for a mid-coast stop to feed tourists to this area and resources such as hotels, beaches, the Dodgertown complex, as well as facilities in town both north and south of Vero Beach. It would also give a convenient public transportation option for travel between the Treasure Coast and the major airports at Orlando and West Palm Beach. A single stop would delay the train very little, and it wouldn't have to be all trains, but it could pay massive dividends to the tourist-related businesses in the area and could generate much financial benefit to the Treasure Coast. The necessary work must be done to develop the business case for a Treasure Coast stop. That's not an easy thing. There are approximately 13 towns, I just counted this on Google, I might be wrong, between Cocoa and West Palm Beach. This means that Vero is only one of 13. Coalescences among towns become very important to add weight to the arguments during Section 106 and EIS hearings. I would strongly encourage Vero Beach to solicit cooperation of other towns and counties and to work with them for a unified cause on as many mitigation measures as possible. Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Let Ms. Chandler go, then we'll
That's
go
fine.
down the line.
Are you going to submit a copy of your
I do.
comments?
Yes.
I'd like to.
I just noted
read-
a couple typos. I'll make those corrections and
Okay.
pass them on to Ms.
Certainly,
Hope.
I'd like to see those. And were you saying in your comments that the environmental impact study will automatically incorporate the comments about historic sites? That they must.
It's usually a separate set of hearings, at least by my experience. In our particular case, the Department of Environmental Affairs for Massachusetts held the EIS equivalent. They called it EIR, but same thing. And the Army Corps of Engineers presided over the Section 106 hearings, of which there were 24.
I guess my question was, will the railroad, in doing their environmental impact study, they will already have
According to their
incorporated-
website, Section 106 is a consideration they must consider.
Okay, that's my question.
That's,
Thank
again,
you.
that's just from their website.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hetty, go right ahead.
Penny actually asked what I was going to ask. If you could provide an electronic or a paper copy to Tammy, she could
I'd be
include
happy
that
to.
with the minutes and save her a whole lot of typing.
Okay. So those are just my comments and my feelings. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you very much for a very thoughtful presentation. Obviously, you have a lot of knowledge and expertise in this area. Unfortunately, I did not understand what a channelized crossing is versus a crossing with the arm.
Oh, it's very simple.
Yeah.
Picture this is the railroad track, and you've got a lane of traffic going this way and a lane of traffic going this way. You've got gates closing each lane, and on one side of the gate, you build a barrier that is substantial enough that keeps the cars in that lane or lanes so they can't go around the gate.
So that keeps, if they get caught, that keeps them in the
In the
line,
channel.
In the channel. So the train will just push them out of the way. How
No,
is
no.
that safer? I don't
no.
understand how that's safer.
No.
Please
Before
explain
the
it.
gate. It's ahead of the gate in the road.
What happens about the car who the gates come down where the car is slowly crossing and the
He
gates
goes
come
on.
down? He goes on. Okay.
Because
so
there's no
train in
gate
front
on
of
the
him.
opposite
Okay.
side.
All right.
And
Very
a
good.
median, if you could, sorry.
Okay.
Just a median separating two.
Medium separate so you can't go across. Okay.
You can't thwart the gate.
Okay. That's thank you for that. I'm
bet.
happy there's a solution to doing this that's be less expensive for the railroad.
And
We
there are a
would
lot of
require them to do that.
There are in that federal document that I quoted. There are a lot of other options to mitigate. For example, video surveillance and things of that nature. Magnetic sensors in the trackway to sense if a car is there. There's all kinds of other things that can be scored into to assist in getting a high enough score in a point of the system. But the big thing is that that's really up to the town to apply for and get that permit, and it must be renewed, I think, every 5 years.
One further question. In your work with this, what was the speed of the trains that were going through the system?
Well, if you know New England, it wasn't 120 miles an hour. Our maximum speed was 50 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Avery?
Thank you so much for being concise and clear.
Well, I apologize for taking so much time, but I felt that you might gain something from it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, please. State your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Richard Schulman. I live at 551 Cypress Road in Vero Beach. I'm not going to discuss details of crossing gates and so forth, because this presumes that this is already a done deal. And I'm going to make the following points. That the All Aboard Florida is not a private enterprise, number one. That it's not a done deal. That users must be compensated. That means homeowners, businesses, communities. And in the case of Vero Beach, All Aboard Florida is talking about bisecting perpendicularly a business section that's already bisected. So we got a quadrisected town if this project goes through. Furthermore, that the company record behind All Aboard Florida is that of a company with too cozy relationships to politicians and government, reliant on subsidies from government. This is why I would argue it's not a private operation. And that the business case for the railroad is not a good one. It's likely to fold and stick the communities involved, the state of Florida, the U.S. taxpayer, with additional burdens. And that the company has a record in the past, which I'll go through, of doing precisely that. Okay, now, on the claim that this is not a private company. A year ago, the company behind All Aboard Florida applied for a Federal Railway Authority loan, which could be up to $563 million, according to the press. Secondly, Governor Scott, on behalf of the state of Florida and its taxpayers, committed the state to $214 million subsidy for building a people mover from the Orlando airport to the yet-to-be-built rail station where this Orlando to Miami train is to be built. So already we're talking about over $200 million already committed and another potential $500 million from the federal government. And the discussion here has been the costs that are going to have to be incurred by Vero Beach and our county and other counties up and down the coast. These are subsidies. And we've heard very little talk of the kind of equity in which the railroad, this private business, is going to compensate all the people that get damaged by this project. Now, given that it is not clearly a private operation, then previous discussions by Mr. Heddy and others in this meeting that the company is under an obligation to disclose its financial particulars, I think is very well taken. There's no way that the railroad should be allowed to proceed without making its business case public, given that it's demanding so many public resources for its completion. My second point, that this is contrary to widespread belief, and the way much of these meetings have been proceeding, of Vero Beach figuring out how to adapt to this done deal. It's not a done deal. Now, the previous speaker mentioned an environmental impact statement that has to come out of the federal government. I'm not too sanguine about this being done as carefully as it should be. No pun intended, but they already railroaded through the West Palm Beach to Miami part of the thing. And they don't seem to have taken into account, among other things, the damage to all the boat owners between West Palm Beach and Miami, who aren't going to be able to use our great inland waterway without great harm because of the railroad bridges that are going to be down half the time because of all these trains passing through. But anyway, be that as it may, sometime early this year, the federal government is supposed to pass on the other part of the whole deal. That is to say, from Orlando down to West Palm Beach. And we should very much have input into that when the federal government, if it follows its procedures, they will submit a draft for public comment. And there's a lot of things that can and should be said at that time. That's the federal side of the thing that could stop the deal, potentially. A second way this can be stopped is by trying to reverse Governor Scott's commitment of $214 million of taxpayer money to the people mover. Why should the state pay for this? Another lever is the right-of-way along State Road 520 from Orlando to Cocoa. Those rights of way are controlled by the Florida Department of Transportation on the Cocoa side, and the Orlando-Orange County Expressway Authority on the Orlando side. Either of those authorities could, if they wish, deny the right-of-way to All Aboard Florida if sufficient political pressure were generated in the wake of computing the costs over against the benefits. It's a principle of equity that users must be compensated for damages. If this is a private operation, as All Aboard Florida claims, then they're subject to nuisance law, tort suits, noise ordinances, for example. Safety issues, and so forth. Loss of business. In the case of the community, the whole Vero Beach being disrupted by this second bisection of the city. Now, the business, what about the company record of this company that won't disclose its financial results and has asked for a loan from the federal government, the Federal Railway Authority, and the Federal Railway Authority won't give any details of the loan application, saying that proprietary business information is involved. You know, the federal government, imagine this, it's potentially going to give $500 million away to a private enterprise and no disclosure. We've seen what can happen with some of these investment projects from the federal government in the last few years. Let's not have that happen again. Now, Fortress Investment Corporation is the actual owners behind Florida East Coast Railways and the All Aboard project, Florida All Aboard. It's got quite a background of very cozy relationships with government and leaving government, the taxpayers, on the hook when the profits stopped coming in and they went bankrupt or defaulted. One notorious example was the Vancouver Winter Olympic Games in 2010. The Fortress defaulted on an $875 million loan payment for the athletic village for the Vancouver Winter Olympics. The city of Vancouver was forced to shell out $450 million Canadian to get the facilities open on time for the Winter Olympics. Interestingly, who was running Fortress, the power behind All Aboard Florida, at the time that this happened? Well, from 2008 to 2011, the head of Fortress was Daniel H. Mudd. I don't know how many people remember him, but he was the chief executive officer, of Fannie Mae in the period from 2005 to 2008. Now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac together, with all their subprime mortgages, all this worthless paper that they picked up from their Wall Street banking friends, and lied to the public about the actual value of their assets. The head of Fortress was the former CEO of Fannie Mae. And he went directly from wrecking Fannie Mae from 2005 to 2008, bringing about our economic collapse in the US and worldwide. He went and was hired as CEO of Fortress, where he stayed until the end of 2011. Why would they hire Mudd? Because he was a consummate crony capitalist operator, somebody good at mixing the affairs of government with the affairs of private enterprise, just like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-supported enterprises, whereby if the investors made money, they get to keep it, and if the thing went bust, as it eventually would, it was the taxpayer that shelled out. Okay? And that's what Florida is looking at straight in the eye with All Aboard America. I've given you a couple of examples of this cozy relationship. I could give you some lesser examples. Fortress thought that John Edwards in 2006 was going to be the next Democratic presidential candidate in 2008. So they paid him for about $450,000 consulting fee for a very modest amount of work. John Edwards, just to cement the relationship, invested $16 million in Fortress. That would have been a very cozy relationship had Edwards not gone belly up in his candidacy. Another example, I regret to say, of this cozy relationship between politicians and private enterprise is Mr. Rusty Roberts here, who's going to present the case for All Aboard Florida. He's the former chief of staff for Congressman John Mica of Orlando. And surprise, Orlando is, Congressman Mica is now the chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That's a very convenient relationship for All Aboard America and Florida East Coast Railway. Now, I said that the company All Aboard America is likely to fold. They started about with an estimate of $1 billion expenses in building this. It then went up to $1.5 billion. We know the historical record throughout the United States of where these high-speed rail or higher-speed rail networks go, California being one case. And Governor Scott in 2011 very correctly rejected the Orlando to Tampa proposed high-speed railway, precisely because he had a strong suspicion that the Florida taxpayer would end up footing the bill. for cost overruns. I suggest the same thing is going to be happening here. Now, let's look at what is all
Sir,
aboard.
I don't want to, could you kind of wrap it up? Because
Okay.
we got some other folks, and we got
Sure.
the point. And the other thing I'm going to ask you to do, too, is your notes, because you've made some really good points today. I'd like to get a copy of those, if you don't mind, when at your convenience.
Okay, I'm
Thank
almost
you.
finished. In the All Aboard Florida literature, they make the case that they can get you from Orlando to Miami in 3 hours. Well, if you do a Google on the turnpike speed, it's 3 hours and 19 minutes. That's a 19-minute difference. Now, how many people around here get around without cars? It's not so easy in Florida. What tourist is going to come into Orlando, take a train to Miami, and sit there without a car? Doesn't make any sense. You need cars to get around these places, to all the interesting sites in both cities. Furthermore, once the government regulators and insurance companies get out of the way, Google and other companies are going to be revolutionizing the auto industry, making cars safe, faster, and effortless as a way of travel. What's going to happen to the All Aboard Florida business model for trying to undercut car travel when this takes place? Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you
have
for
a
your time.
question.
We have a
Yes.
question, Ms. Chandler?
Yes, Mr. Schulman, you indicated, well, you've made a lot of statements. I don't know whether I would call them insinuations or whatever, but coming forward to do that, would you be willing to disclose what your background is? You come up with a lot of statements, and so I'm wondering what your background is, your professional background that provide you the information to make
Okay.
the statements that you're making.
Well, I'm just a modestly educated person that happens to know how to use the internet. And this information was pulled off the Federal Railway Authority site, from Florida newspapers, from the statements of All Aboard America. And I can get to the sources. If any of these points are controversial, I'd be glad to.
Well, I just
Provide
wondered,
my
you
sources.
made a lot of, you pointed the finger a lot, and I just wondered what your background was and where you got your information.
I said I had an
Another-
education. Anybody
an-
who has an education can dig this. They spend a day
Another,
doing this.
you indicated that there was an opportunity to, for the Aviation Authority as well as Florida DOT not to go into contract. Is that what you said? With All Aboard Florida?
Not the Aviation Authority. The right-of-way from Orlando to Cocoa is controlled by two authorities. The first stretch is by the Orlando Orange County Authority. The second stretch is by the Florida Department of Transportation. They own the
Okay.
right-of-way.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
Mr. Hetty?
I just want to say thank you for bringing all the information forward. I appreciate it.
Anyone else?
Would
Nick,
it be,
Go ahead,
I'm
Ms.
sorry,
Chandler.
would it be appropriate at this time to ask a question of Mr. Roberts to clarify something?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay.
Mr. Roberts, if you don't mind.
Mr. Roberts, I understood from a meeting maybe a month or so, I think it was our first meeting, that there was already a lease in place. Is that correct?
For the
With
corridor mentioned?
DOT?
That's correct. The Florida DOT lease is in place for All Aboard Florida lease, that section of State Road 520 that they own. An agreement has been passed by the Orange County Orlando Expressway Authority for leasing that portion of the corridor that they control.
Okay.
We also have a lease with the Orlando Airport, an agreement with the Orlando Airport Authority for access to that, and we're paying a fee in every one of those cases.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, more public comment? We'll do the lady first and the gentleman in the back. Come right up, ma'am. And if you would please state your name and address for the record.
Sure.
Thank
Melinda
you.
Meikle, 1612 West Camino del Rio, Vero Beach. I'm a citizen, and I'm not just ask. I think there's some questions that we should really know. When we heard about the Board, Florida, based on the presentation by Mr. Roberts, apparently there are 50 million tourists they're trying to accommodate, and basically the railroad is for tourism, not local travel. In that whole scenario, wouldn't we need to know, and maybe it's been answered, I don't know, the ridership and the cost per ticket? I know from Boston to Washington, D.C., it's anywhere from $154 to $420 a ticket one way. So I have a hard stretch of imagination to figure a family of four going to Disneyland and then hopping on a train going to Miami. I think we should know those things as to whether they'll be profitable or not. Since from what I understand, most trains in America are subsidized. The other issue I'm bringing up is the environment, which is apparently an important issue. It seems to me this is more congestion. So how environmentally sound is this? As well as our little paradise here.
Just a minute. I think Ms. Chandler has a question.
No,
No?
don't.
Mr. Heddy?
Thank you.
You know, I think that in fairness to Mr. Roberts, I think he's given answers to a couple of those questions. The railroad's looking to compete with the airlines. So if you look at what the ticket prices are from Miami to Orlando, you'll get a pretty good.
Oh, you mean compare the railroad with the flight ticket?
That was my understanding from Mr. Roberts. Yeah, so he has provided that information. There's still other financial information that we haven't gotten, but the ticket price, if you're going to go from Miami to Orlando, it's going to be in terms of price. Which
Sort
would
of
you
an
rather? You rather ride on the plane or a train?
Okay, well, if they're going to do this, we want them to be successful because it's a big effort
absolutely.
to go through, isn't it? Okay, thank you.
Next, please state your name for the record, please, and address, sir.
Good afternoon, Commission, or whatever you are. I'm Joseph Cafanti, and I live at 441 Holly Road in the city of Vero Beach. Just before I start, I'm going to give you a little bit of information here that you may or may not know. I'll get to my education in a minute. The trains will, except for the first two in the morning and these are proposed now, first two in the morning and the first two. Let me stop myself and interrupt myself here a minute. This is a very, very, very important issue. Not what I'm going to talk about, but the whole thing. And I think that this commission should allow all the time in the world to focus on this and understand what's going on. Okay. Except for the two trains in the morning and the two first trains in the morning, last two trains in the evening, any train will pass another train 5 times. And these passage points will be determined by the rate of the train and the distance from where it starts. So I don't know, I'm not able to ascertain that information, develop that information. I don't know how fast the train is, how long it's going to stop in Fort Lauderdale, but the trains could be, theoretically, if they're on schedule, pass each other in Vero Beach. It's possible, because there's 5 places that it's going to happen. Let's see, if they don't pass at the same time simultaneously in Vero Beach, then it could be 5 minutes apart, 10 minutes apart, 15, 20, I think up to 30, but I didn't think that through completely because I decided to take a nap. But I think a half hour is maybe it's almost, it can't go more than that because then it's the other way around. They're going to be passing each other within.
So you're talking about the intersections?
No, I'm talking about passing. This one north and the southbound train are going to pass each other. The northbound train is going to pass 5 southbound trains on the way to Orlando. So having said that, the city of Vero Beach is about, from 12th Street to Aviation Boulevard is about 2 miles. It turns out that using the distance equals rate times time equation that every little kid in the 10th grade knows is it turns out that it's going to take about a minute and a half for the train to go from 12th Street, where somebody was just hit by a train a couple of weeks ago, to Aviation Boulevard. And if you divide that by 6, because there are actually 7 crossings, I think if you count the one on Route 60, there's 2 of them there, really. Anyway, it turns out that there's a crossing every 15 seconds. If the horn whistle is going to blow, it's going to have to blow continuously for a minute and a half. That's just in the city of Vero Beach. That doesn't count what's coming from 8th Street and what's coming from 41st Street. I think that's the next one over. I just thought you'd keep that in mind. There's going to be 5, and depending on the schedule, if one train is late, it's going to move that point of passage. And maybe somehow the railroad has gotten a hold of a pamphlet written by Mussolini of how to keep these trains on time, but I don't know if that's true or not. I think that the whole issue, as far as I'm concerned, is one of safety and common sense. And as an engineer, I get to my education. I most certainly have a degree in engineering and from one of the better engineering schools in the country. One of the things that an engineer engages with, has to do with, is looking at a project not from the safety standpoint of view, but a common sense. And I don't want to explain that, but common sense is more important than safety. And what the common sense says is that there is such a thing as a law of diminishing return. And that opens the door to fanaticism, crazy ideas that somebody gets, and there's always somebody willing to jump on the bandwagon of any moronic idea. I think it's ludicrous to drive a train at 110 miles, and believe me, I'm all in favor of trains. Use them all the time. Ludicrous to think that it's okay to drive a train 110 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour through a heavily populated area for miles and miles and miles. I don't think that is a prudent thing to do. Why then would somebody decide to put this forth? Well, they always tell you to follow the money. Now this is speculation on my part. You follow the money. This company, private company, wants the state to fork over millions and millions and millions of dollars with no promise, no guarantee that any good is going to come from it other than the fact that they get their railroad modernized, the tracks modernized, they get to put in a separate lane. And I happen to know why an additional set of tracks, and I happen to know why the tracks were ripped up, because some long time ago, some government, not state, but I think federal government, decided to tax the railroads in a different fashion and caused them back in the 60s to start ripping up their second set of tracks because it made them uneconomical. I also know that the federal government, through the ICC, I just want to show you that I'm covered the waterfront in this particular case. The ICC ruled against the railroads and disallowed them, wouldn't allow them to lower their rates so they compete favorably with the trucking industry, and that happened in the 50s. So a lot of crazy things have gone on with the railroad, not to mention this new one, or to mention this newest effort. This is total lunacy. I've said before to people, this is the age of insanity, and this is evidence of it, that they would propose to put this train through here. And the last thing I want to say is this business about developing a system so that you don't have to blow the whistle. Most of the deaths, I'm pretty sure, or at least I hope so, I hope that the death rate by auto isn't higher than the already ridiculous rate of pedestrians. The amount of people that have been killed, I told the city council that in 6 years period of time, 260 pedestrians have been killed by railroads in the state of Florida. And that's trains going at 50 miles an hour, I guess, at pretty much average. Just use your imagination and think about the trains going at 100 miles an hour through the city of Vero Beach and what's going to happen. And accidents happen. We all know that. What's going to happen when a train derails at 100 miles an hour? Think about it. It's going to be catastrophic, especially when it slams into a gas station or a loaded fuel truck, which already happened down in South Florida, if you remember, 10 years ago or so. So this whole thing is I'm sure, is just a money-grabbing opportunity by a group of people who you don't even know who they are. Apparently they're well-connected, talking about the FEC people. Well-connected people. And they're going to walk away with a ton of dough, ton of taxpayers' dough, and we're going to get nothing out of it but a hard time, heartaches, and eventually this thing, as an engineer, I would say it ain't going to work. Thank you very much for your time. And the chairman, I appreciate everything that you're doing. You're doing a great job.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Cavante? Okay. Anyone else that would like to speak from the public, please step forward. Seeing none, we'll close the public.
Before you close public hearing, can this be added? We have, the city's received, you've received some questions by Victor DiMattia. Could those questions be included under public comment so that they're easily found in the record?
Ms. Falk? Yes.
And did you want to mention some of those things, the questions that he asked, or?
Why don't you go right ahead?
Mr. DiMattia notes that the rail lines from Miami, that there's lines that exist northwest up to the top of Lake Okeechobee, and then runs over to the center of the state, and that's all Florida East Coast right away now. And then from that point up to Orlando, it's CXX, and it all goes through very low population densities. So he has some questions as to why they chose the more populated area, and I think it's certainly a question that we're going to want to answer for that citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from the public to speak at this time? Okay, we'll close this portion of the meeting. Under Chairman's Matters, we're on number 5. Mr. Scott Stradley, which was our alternate, he needed to resign. He had other things that he needed to tend to. He sent a letter in, a very nice letter, thanking us all for being on the commission. And we sent him a thank you letter thanking him. We really appreciated his service and him putting in the time. We have a new member, Miss Debbie Avery. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself briefly, we would appreciate that.
I'm on the board of Main Street, and that's why I'm here today. We had a representative, Scott was our representative.
Please put your mic on.
Sorry. Now can you hear me? Okay, I'm on the board of Main Street, and I'm here as a representative for Main Street, Vero Beach, and I work at the Cultural Council. That's it.
All right, thank you.
Just a quick question,
go
Mr.
right ahead,
Chairman.
Mr. Heady.
Did the city vote, or that's the Main Street delegate? Was the city council? Did they vote at all? They did.
Yes, they asked that a representative be on this commission from Main Street.
Right.
And Mrs. Avery did send her application, and last Tuesday the council voted to put her on the commission.
And at the time that they voted, were there any other considerations? I know that there was some, the tally of the ballots from the last vote were a little different. Was there any other consideration at the time?
No, she was the only
addition of Ms.
applicant.
Avery? Thank you.
Okay, and to continue on with my matters, on February 19th, we had a meeting with the Main Street folks. I'd like to thank Mrs. Forbes, Mrs. Manous, Miss Vicki Gould. They helped put this together. The place that it was held is the Osceola Bistro Patio Restaurant. Thank you very much to the owners that hosted this. And what we took away from that get-together, if you look up on the wall here, there's a lot of the concerns. We had a full house there. And if you listen to some of the speakers today, you'll notice up on those papers there's some of those similar concerns. And those are the concerns that will be addressed either some today or at a later meeting. Those concerns we have compiled in front of us. Each commissioner has a number of those concerns underneath them. The other thing that we will be talking about when we come to members' matters, like Ms. Chandler, she sent us some information, and she made reference to, I think it was page 55, and she's going to give us a briefing with her concerns with that. So I'm going to have her go first. Also, Mr. Don Cortell, he sent us some information, an email dated February 20th, 2014, that he sent us all, and I'm going to have him speak on that. Then we'll go into the rest of the members' meetings. Okay, that brings us into the next portion of our meeting. We have some presentations. First of all, I'd like to thank very much, a big thank you, to Mrs. Kim Delaney for coming out. Also, we have Mr. Rusty Roberts here with us. These folks are our guests. They are here to answer our questions. They both represent their companies, and they do a fine job. So I appreciate you coming out and taking your time. Ma'am, you have the mic.
Thanks. So I have a little presentation, and speaking of Mr. O'Connor, it sounded like it'd be appropriate. So for the record, Kim Delaney, I'm with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, actually, not a corporation, but a public planning agency, which I think many of you know. For the benefit of the public, the Regional Planning Council is a regional agency that has a 28-member governing board that consists of elected officials from the cities and the counties, as well as 18 elected officials, and then 10 appointees by the governor's office. And so on rail matters, the region has been asked to take kind of a coordinating role in trying to understand the issues related to this project, as well as other rail projects like the FEC Amtrak Corridor Project, which there are many familiar faces from our work in trying to advance that project as well. Is this a good way to advance the slides? Super. Okay, and so in speaking with Mr. O'Connor, it seems as though there might be a benefit in zooming out for a moment to just describe kind of the quiet zone circumstances as we understand them to be, and doing the research that we've done. Speaking to the Federal Railroad Administration, which is the federal agency that has jurisdiction over quiet zones, with FDOT, the Florida Department of Transportation, which is the state agency that has jurisdiction, and then we've been working with really each of the cities and counties and metropolitan planning organizations in different ways, trying to assemble a quiet zone approach that hopefully makes some sense and can be implemented. So with the permission of the commission, I'd like to kind of walk through those kind of briefly, but to just set a context, if that's okay. All right, so with your permission, we worked with a private engineering firm in trying to really understand how quiet zones work. So I've drilled this down to like 6 slides. So a quiet zone is defined, and you had an earlier speaker that touched on some of these points, and I'll just try to bring them together if possible. So quiet zones are regulated by the Code of Federal Regulations, and essentially what they allow a public agency to do. The City of Vero Beach, for example, as a public agency that has grade crossings, it's asked permission to cross the railroad. FDOT also has asked permission to cross the railroad with certain state roads. So what the quiet zone regulations do is they allow a public agency to, at its expense, install additional safety, either infrastructure or put safety programs in place to raise the safety rating of a grade crossing to a point high enough so that that public agency can declare to the Federal Railroad Administration, we've done all the things necessary to make this safe enough to ask the railroad to not blow its horn, and that public agency then declares, if you will, that this is now a quiet zone. That's kind of how it works. There's a cost with respect to capital. There's some safety infrastructure that's typically necessary, and I'll talk through that in a moment. And there's an O&M cost, if you will, an operating and maintenance cost. The city of Vero, for example, already pays annually to FEC the right to cross the railroad with its grade crossings. And that's there are 340 grade crossings that exist between Brevard and Miami, the stretch of this All Aboard Florida project. And I forgot to mention, these comments are really related to what we understand with respect to All Aboard Florida. So there's 340 grade crossings of all the grade crossings that exist from Jacksonville to Miami. And each of those was put in place at the request of a local entity. The railroad never said we'd like to cross our own railroad with your roadway, but instead, over time, from the 1890s until, as recently as the last one that was permitted, probably in the 2000s, each of those grade crossings is governed by what's called a grade crossing agreement. And so there's one that exists for every one of the grade crossings in the city of Vero and Indian River County, as it does for all the grade crossings that lie between Cocoa and Miami. And each of those assigns a series of costs to the local entity to operate and maintain the grade crossing. So as long as it's maintained safely and the costs to operate and repair, for example, the gates that close or the roadways that lead up to the grade crossing, as long as those are paid for by the entity that requested them over time, the city of Vero, for example, that grade crossing remains open. And so again, with respect to the grade crossings, there's federal law that actually dictates how the horns must be blown. So I didn't know this. This is something I learned in talking with these different agencies. So federal regulations actually dictate the operator of the train, the conductor, has to blow the horn one long, two short, and one long as it approaches the grade crossing, and it's within roughly a half mile. Sometimes it happens a little sooner, sometimes it happens a little later. It depends how fast the train is moving, but that's kind of how the horn situation occurs. And so federal law acknowledges that there's an opportunity to get the trains to not blow their whistle. So physical safety improvements or programmatic things can be installed to raise the safety rating. The cost of those things are borne by the local agency requesting to make it quiet. And then the operating and maintenance cost, the cost of raising and lowering the gates, the electricity, the replacement of those gates over time, as well as, and this is the trickier one, the liability for any accidents that may occur, also transfers from the railroad, which blows the horn to make it safe, to the local agency that asks for it to be a quiet zone. Okay, so that's an O&M cost, an operations and maintenance cost, that we're trying to get an estimate as to what that may cost local governments. And so that's kind of a little bit of an overview. With respect to new quiet zones, according to the Federal Railroad Administration, which is the FRA, all grade crossings today must have gates, lights, what's called constant warning time, which is letting the operator know if there's something wrong with the intersection, the conductor can find out, and a power out indicator. So if the gate's not going to open, there's an indicator that lets the railroad, the conductor know that it's not safe for them to cross. There's an inventory that's maintained in the state of Florida for every grade crossing in the state of Florida, and there are many. The local agency has the responsibility, in this instance, to make sure the information is up to date. Okay, so there's a diagnostic responsibility, if you will, for the local agency who says we want a quiet zone at 14th Street or whatever, 20th, or State Road 60, whichever one. So the local agency is responsible for making sure, again, the information in this inventory is accurate. So that's really a programmatic activity, not so much a cost, but a responsibility. There are some other considerations that we think are important to point out. These questions come up often. If you have a quiet zone, the conductor still has, frankly, the responsibility as well as the right to blow the horn if there's something on the tracks. So just because you've made it a quiet zone and you've put in extra infrastructure to make sure nobody can get in, if there's a cow on the track, if there's a car on the track or a person or some other obstacle, the conductor may still blow the horn. So that's just a right that remains reserved, if you will, to the railroad entity. Now, there's some stipulations with respect to the length of the quiet zone, okay? Because, as I mentioned, you've got to start blowing the horn a quarter mile before you get to the grade crossing. And so what federal law says is if you're going to put a quiet zone in place, it needs to be at least a half a mile long. Because when you're blowing that horn for the first grade crossing, essentially you're already blowing that horn for the next one. So as you consider quiet zones in Vero, one of the things to think about is if you have grade crossings that are within a half a mile, you really want to think about making both of them quiet zones. You're probably going to have to. There's a little variation with respect to how you draw the oval, if you will. So you don't have to center it on the grade crossing. You can shift it a little bit to get away from maybe one that you don't want to necessarily make a quiet zone, but that's a consideration, at least a half mile. So if you have a number that are fairly close, what most municipalities are looking at now, and this is a very active discussion to the south, is essentially the whole downtown, right? Because you have a number of grade crossings in a small area, and there's typically a bit of a break before you get to the next set of grade crossings, which might be in a residential community where grade crossings are a priority, or they might be in an industrial area where grade crossings just aren't as important. So that's a consideration. I mentioned already the modern features necessary just per the federal requirements are the things that are noted: active warning, constant warning time, and power out indicators. Okay, there are two types of improvements that enable the city of Vero, for example, to establish a quiet zone. So one category of those things are called supplemental safety measures. Those are the physical things that we build in the grade crossing. So going from 2 gates to 4 gates, right? 4 quadrant gates. That's a physical barrier that keeps people from making bad decisions and getting in the track when there's a train coming. There are other things like converting streets from one-way to two-way. From two-way to one-way. That actually raises your safety rating because now you only have folks moving in one direction. So that actually, Vero already has taken advantage of that with its roadway network, and that'll be reflected in the safety ratings that you'll find when you go on the Federal Railroad Administration's website. And there are rating, again, scores for each of the grade crossings. There was an earlier speaker who spoke about channelization devices. And so those are really physical barriers like medians that can be conformed in various ways. You can have little reflectors that are posted on a median so cars can't get around and cut through the grade crossing. You can build a physical decorative median. They don't have to be ugly, so they can be attractively made with some appropriate materials that make sense, for example, in your downtown if that's the area of focus. But the point with those is to physically prevent people from getting into the other lane and breaking through the grade crossing. You really can't prevent people from making bad decisions, but these types of improvements are designed to make it very, very hard for someone to break the rules and get into the grade crossing and then cause an accident. There are also wayside horns. That's another mitigating factor. Those are horns that blow down the street instead of the front of the train. And I don't have a diagram for you, but I'll be happy to send it. So the noise footprint for a horn on the front of a train extends forward and somewhat wide along the track. So all the folks living on the track know exactly when the train is coming because they can hear it in their backyard. And they're really not the folks that you're trying to prevent from getting in the grade crossing, so it's unfortunate. So the way wayside horns work instead is they're mounted in the grade crossing, and when the train's coming, instead of blowing it on the train, you sound the horn in the roadway, essentially, and the horn blows down the street. It doesn't go as far because it's not moving like the train. It's fixed, and it's more contained because you only have to let folks know right by the grade crossing that there's a train coming, so don't go in the grade crossing. It's not desirable for the folks that live right there because it's loud in that location, but it does prevent the horn from blowing kind of through those backyards. And then temporarily or permanently closing a street, of course, not a surprise. If you don't have a legal grade crossing, then you can have a quiet zone and they don't have to blow their whistle. So that's one category. Those are the physical things. The other types of things are called alternative safety measures. And those are programmatic things. Your earlier speaker spoke to the idea of doing surveillance or doing a safety program or installing extra signage. There's a whole category of improvements like that a public agency can undertake to, again, raise the safety rating so the horn doesn't have to be blown. Okay? So those are how those two things are differentiated. When I spoke with Mrs. Vaughk, I know that you wanted to get an update with respect to what's happening in other communities. So I've just assembled just a very brief overview of what's happening. Not every community is in the same place with respect to discussing quiet zones. And one thing to perhaps consider is that quiet zones aren't as important in every community as other things. So in the communities where there are active and vibrant downtowns and main streets, quiet zones are a very important conversation, and those communities are mobilized, and they're planning for them, and they're trying to identify funding for them, and they're very engaged in the dialogue. But there are other communities where the grade crossings are in industrial areas, for example, or some commercial areas, and the quiet zone activity it's not as bothersome to the same folks as it is to the residents. So that said, just moving kind of south to north, Miami-Dade is still trying to figure out whether quiet zones are going to be a priority. Most of the grade crossings run through industrial areas on the FEC. My guess is if there's a regional approach, probably Miami-Dade will participate. But if there isn't a regional, kind of a broad application for funding, let's say, that comes from the region, I don't know that Miami-Dade will participate. Their local governments and Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, haven't taken a position yet. In Broward County, the grade crossings tend to be very much in active and vibrant residential neighborhoods and downtown districts. It's a very high priority. The Broward MPO, again, that's Metropolitan Planning Organization, has already allocated funding, $2 million a year for, I think it's 4 years, which is $8 million of local funding allocated to the capital costs of quiet zones. And for the most part, each of the communities along the corridor are already planning for quiet zones and looking at their budget to figure out how they can generate local dollars, both for capital and O&M. Palm Beach County is probably the most active, and I mentioned there's 340 grade crossings on the corridor. 118 are just in Palm Beach County alone, so they really have more than their fair share. It's a very big county, though. So that said, there's a very active task force underway looking at quiet zones. It's sponsored by the Florida League of Cities. The Palm Beach MPO, again, Metropolitan Planning Organization, has already allocated $6.6 million of local funding to buy down the cost of grade crossings for the local governments. Each of the local governments is looking at all of its grade crossings to figure out which ones are the most important. All of the communities with active downtowns have already prioritized both funding and actions by their staff to get quiet zones positioned for construction commensurate with All Aboard Florida. Palm Beach County has also really been the lead agency, or the lead community, if you will, and there's a number of different entities within that group to get legislative requests in motion. And so in Palm Beach County, the government affairs liaison, Todd Bonlaren, who represents Palm Beach County in Tallahassee, has already been in Tallahassee for the past 2 months with a very active legislative request and gubernatorial request for funding. It's much more expensive because there's a lot more grade crossings in Palm Beach County, but they're already in asking the legislature for funding to match their $6.6 million and any overage that there might be to fund grade crossings through the entire county. Martin County has already initiated its legislative request as well. I just briefed Representative Magar, in fact, this morning on this subject, and we're going to be briefing each of the members of the legislative delegation. I briefed Senator Nelson's staff yesterday. So there's very active dialogue underway with both the congressional and legislative delegation to identify funding, if it's available, to kind of match some type of local contribution, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. St. Lucie County, the city of Fort Pierce has taken some very specific steps to request funding and try to begin to analyze quiet zones. I don't believe St. Lucie County Commission has yet. And Indian River County, of course, we're here and we're in this discussion now. Brevard County, I'm not sure, but I will contact the folks in Brevard. And when I follow up with you with any other information you want, I'll have an assemblage of kind of where each of these communities is with respect to their activities. So that's where the local governments, the counties, and the MPOs are with respect to activity. Some are much more aggressive because they've been at it a while. And it's probably important to mention in the southern counties, because Tri-Rail is existing and also proposed on the FEC, those communities are very engaged in rail discussions and have been for like 8 years. So they're really kind of in the know with respect to rail improvements and activity. With respect to FDOT, the Florida Department of Transportation, the Florida Department of Transportation is currently in the field with Florida East Coast Industries, as well as the Federal Railroad Administration and the local governments. And they're conducting what are called diagnostic field reviews. And so that's field work that's necessary. I mentioned that inventory of what's out there has to be accurate. Well, one of the ways to make sure it's accurate is to go in the field and check and see, well, it says 2 gates, and look, there's 2 gates, and checking the traffic counts and the level of activity and improvements that exist around each grade crossing. So DOT is actively in the field now doing that work. In fact, they're in Palm Beach County today. They'll be in Martin County. Today is Wednesday. Palm Beach County tomorrow, Martin County on Friday and next week, and I believe they'll likely be scheduling St. Lucie County, Indian River, and Brevard in the next several weeks. I know FECI has been fairly efficient in communicating with local staffs, where local staffs want to get out in the field and join FDOT in those analyses. One of the things the council has very strongly suggested is that if the project is going to be constructed, and that is a presumed condition, we don't know that for sure, but it sure seems like it's moving in that direction. So if the project is going to be constructed, the council has very strongly suggested to local governments, if you need a turn lane, if you need to widen a road, if you need a sidewalk or a bike lane, or if you want to improve a sidewalk to make it to improve it from a 6-lane sidewalk to a 10-lane multi-use corridor, the time to understand those locations is probably now, so that when you're in the field doing diagnostic reviews with FDOT, those locations can be identified and they can be constructed at the same time these other improvements take place. What the council would suggest is, if you want to make any improvements out there, the time to make those improvements is going to be when the corridor goes under construction, because it's going to be very expensive to do it later. Once FECI is done with double tracking and the roads get put back, you don't want to go back and dig that stuff up and add a sidewalk or a bike lane or a turn lane, because it's going to really be cost prohibitive. So we would make that suggestion to you. FDOT is also actively in the process of estimating costs for quiet zone improvements. And so the diagnostic review, I should mention, is really focused on what is the safety infrastructure necessary to allow FECI to run the train service, right? That's going to establish a new baseline. And then on top of that, is there any additional infrastructure necessary to allow a quiet zone to happen? And if so, what's the estimated cost of that? FDOT is funded to do that analysis in Palm Beach County and Broward County, and it's been funded by those 2 entities, the Broward MPO and the Palm Beach MPO. That's going to give us kind of a good rule of thumb as to what probably is going to be necessary to make a quiet zone happen in other places. So even though it's not necessarily an apples to apples, I think we'll learn a lot and we'll get some good working knowledge about what the costs are typically going to be for quiet zones in different conditions. A 2-lane road, a 4-lane road, a 6-lane road, a 2-lane road in a neighborhood versus a 2-lane road in a downtown. We're going to get some, I think, general insight as to what those typical improvements are going to be and what typically the costs will be. As soon as we have that information, we will communicate that to all of the counties so we all have that to work with so we can be a little smarter. That's FDOT. With respect to the regional planning councils, what we've been doing, one, we don't have a model to follow. We have never had a project like All Aboard Florida proposed in the region. In fact, there's not a model like this in the country. And so we're trying to understand what the responsibility is of the regional planning council, what the responsibility and also the opportunities are for the local governments and the citizens and the businesses that are along the corridor. With respect to quiet zones, we have tried to assemble at least enough information so we can get a game plan together as a region to figure out how might we want to best proceed. It's great that Vero has assembled a commission to have these conversations. What we know is that if we need to make a legislative request for funding, if each city does that individually, we'll be using very small megaphones that don't travel very far. But if we make that request along 6 or 7 counties, it'll be a much larger megaphone and we'll have a much better chance of getting funding. That's typically how the legislative process works. So we would suggest, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, if we can work together as cities and counties, we have a better chance, most likely, of getting funding and getting any other improvements that we need. The other active role the regional planning councils will play, the regional planning council, this one, is going to be responsible for the 4 counties that where we operate, Indian River, Martin, St. Lucie, and Palm Beach. There will be an environmental impact statement, which is that environmental permit that was mentioned by an earlier speaker. Florida East Coast Industries is producing that document, but it will actually be published by the agency that's responsible for reviewing it, just to kind of set up the characters for you. So the Federal Railroad Administration is actually the agency, as we understand it, who will publish that document, and it becomes available for public review and comment. The Regional Planning Council has a formal role. We will review that document. We'll do a scoping review. We will collect the comments from all the cities and the counties and the agencies and the public, and we will try to assemble that into a rational set of formal comments to put on the record, if you will. Okay? We know that quiet zones is a very important consideration for many communities. Certainly quiet zones is one of the things the council's tried to become more knowledgeable about. We would suggest that where it can be afforded, it's certainly a way to improve both quality of life and economic opportunities, let's say, along the corridor. There are some communities that say, gosh, quiet zones are really overdue. We wish we had them 20 years ago. And so it's been a very active conversation in places like West Palm Beach and Delray and Boca that have been trying to establish quiet zones for years and years. This is probably the least expensive time to do it because All Aboard Florida is going to be out there doing all this construction work anyway. So once they have mobilization in place and they have to do some safety improvements, hopefully that gets the communities that want quiet zones most of the way there. Okay? So that's kind of a big picture view of what's happening. Questions about that, or you want me to keep rolling? I know it's late, so you've had a lot of public speakers.
Right ahead, sir.
You seem to be responding to the fact that the existing structure of costs will continue. Do you believe, as a planner, that the owner of a right-of-way can do anything they want with that right-of-way, and the impacts that it might have on the community will be borne by the community rather than by the operator?
Right. Well, there's some, the way we understand it, and certainly we're open to more information if there is some. So, but the way we understand the legislation, there are some sovereign protections that are afforded FEC in state statute, and that's how the rail corridor was established. I worked for local government for 10 years before I came to the Regional Planning Council, and so I did not enjoy my interactions with FEC when we tried to get more grade crossings and we tried to get pedestrian crossings and we tried to landscape the corridor, and it was extremely expensive because as I learned professionally in that context, and as I have become more knowledgeable working for the council now, there's a different set of rules that apply to certain entities in the state.
So they're protected by state statute, which could be changed.
I guess theoretically.
As a regional planning agency, if it's determined that the sovereignty that the railroad is basically exhibiting is detrimental to the communities it's passing through, couldn't the regional planning agency take a position to assist the local governments in attempting to change the legal relationship between the railroad and the general public?
And the state of Florida?
Yes.
I mean, it's certainly something that could be asked of the council.
Okay.
The council doesn't typically get involved in activities like that. I mean, we're an advisory public agency, but certainly if it was a majority opinion of the council could take, a position that was appropriate from the posture of Regional Planning Council.
Thank you, because I'm quite concerned about your presentation, and well, in the sense that we should make a lot of local decisions to make major investments of capital in order to forestall a problem down the line, which may or may not come to fruition because of all the other issues. That why can't we, as a group of municipalities, using your offices, develop some arguments that the unlimited use of this right-of-way, there has to be some mitigations that the railroad pays for because they're the ones causing the problem of safety, primarily, as far as I'm concerned, and that they should bear the cost of that.
Sure. I think I was directed in part of my research to a fairly substantial body of case law that again and again reinforced the position of FEC with its sovereignty. But that doesn't mean there couldn't be a future action by, this or a future legislature to change a law.
Yeah.
It's certainly conceivable. But what my council has directed our staff to do is with the existing laws, if the project is to occur, what are the things that what are the things the local governments are seeking, for example, quiet zones being one, and how might they be accomplished? What other funding sources can be brought to bear? Can tax dollars from other entities, the state or federal grant dollars, be brought to bear on quiet zones? So we're actively pursuing that. We have reviewed the existing grade crossing agreements, and actually there's a body of attorneys in Palm Beach County which has spent innumerable hours on this subject over the past 18 months. There's a body of professionals that have been working on the structure of the grade crossing agreements, and there's a group of attorneys representing all the municipalities along the corridor that have been reviewing the legal documentation. So, and there has not been a conclusion that I'm aware of to date that suggests there's an alternative. That doesn't mean that one doesn't exist, but again, based on the research that we've been presented to date and the actions of our council, we've been asked to kind of understand what's possible under the law that we have, and the relationships that we have as public entities to a private agency or private company, and what are the things that we can do. So, but certainly, your suggestion is one that can always be brought to the council for the council's deliberation. Absolutely. Okay?
Thank you.
Mr.
Sure.
Hetty?
Yeah, follow up on some of the things Don said, and some of the answers were that there was legislation. Well, legislation means one thing, but the body of law that you talked about that you've been exposed to, that probably means more than the legislation. So could you provide that body of case law that you've been exposed to Tammy, so that she can make it available
I'd be
for
happy
us?
to. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So yeah, there's a fairly long history of case law within which the FEC, really the parent company, has been questioned over time, over all sorts of matters. So I can assure you, the city that I worked for, we really wished there was a different interpretation that could be drawn upon, but unfortunately we couldn't manage to find that. And so the city was happy that it was able to put parking in and landscaping. There was a cost, and there continues to be a cost to that. But FEC, again, had the protections that exist between the statutory framework within which the state operates and the body of case law that protects its kind of sovereign immunity, if you will. That was the brakes. So that's, but certainly I'll be happy to forward that to Tammy.
And Tammy, if you would be so kind as to send Kim a reminder to get that. Thank you.
Mrs. Delaney, thank you very much for coming. I know you're very busy, and thank you for all of the information. It was very good for us. Thank you.
And just two other points for you.
Sure.
I do have a timeline for you to lay out these various pieces of activity. And so I mentioned to you the diagnostic field reviews, and that's the bar that's over here in, oh my gosh, it's in FSU colors. That wasn't intentional. It's garnet and gold. It would be orange and blue positive down here. Okay, so diagnostic field review is underway. Again, I believe FECI's schedule suggests that it'll be doing those reviews up in Indian River County about 2 weeks or so. Certainly the city staff and the county staff will be made aware of that schedule so they can join them in the field. I've been reminded they're not intended for the public. You have to wear steel-toed boots, hats, and vests, and it's a technically oriented safety review. There have been a lot of members of the public who've said, gosh, we want to go out there in the field, but again, proper safety precautions are certainly expected. They're trained professionals that are out there that are evaluating these grade crossings. The local governments are kind of in motion, if you will. There is a TIGER grant, which is Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery. That's the acronym, TIGER. There have been 5 rounds of TIGER grants that have been awarded by the federal government. Pardon me, the notice of funding availability for the latest round was actually issued today, $600 million. Palm Beach and Broward County absolutely will be seeking a TIGER grant. The grant application, I think the preliminary application is due in a month, and the full application is due in 2. TIGER grants do require a 50-50 match. And so, as I mentioned, both of those communities have been already allocating local funds, and the local governments have been identifying other funds that could be used as match. Those are also the communities that are in the process of dialogue with the legislature, trying to get a legislative appropriation to also act as match if those dollars need to be secured to offset or leverage, if you will, a tighter grant. So that's in motion as well. The other thing to mention, two other points that have been important to council, if I may. One is the ability to advance the Amtrak FEC corridor project. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, this diagram illustrates the Amtrak FEC corridor project that was developed over the past couple of years. There's $118 million in the state's 5-year work program that's now available to pay for station construction costs as well as the connections necessary to enable the service. There's no longer a need for Amtrak to secure trains. They secured trains 2 years ago, so there's enough train capacity, if you will, for them to operate the service. It's our understanding there's some active discussion underway between Amtrak and the state with respect to advancing this project. I think council's position will be an expectation that if the All Aboard Florida project goes forward, that this Amtrak project go forward commensurate with that. So these stations happen at the same time. I think council was very clear in its discussions on Friday that without passenger rail access in the northern communities, Stewart, Fort Pierce, Vero, Cocoa, Melbourne, well, really, Cocoa and Melbourne is where it stops. And then the Amtrak project includes stations in Titusville, Daytona, and St. Augustine. So that said, without providing some other form of passenger rail access to generate economic benefit to the northern communities, well, there's not a lot of benefit coming from all this work taking place on the corridor. And so council's been very consistent in our priority for this project, the city of Vero, the chamber, Main Street as well. There's 180 resolutions of support advocating for this project. We kind of function like the Hamptons of South Florida, right? So if you could take the train up for the weekend and spend a couple $100s in Vero or Stewart or Fort Pierce, that's a local economic benefit that doesn't put any stress on the roadway network. And so there's lots of compelling reasons why this project has been highly prioritized for its economic benefits. Again, the council's position has consistently been, if there's going to be passenger rail service out there, you got to provide service to as many communities as you can. This is an easy project. It's kind of take it off the shelf. The plans are done. The city of Vero spent a lot of time and energy identifying station locations and figuring out how it could participate. There's no operating subsidy necessary from the state. Amtrak would run this service as part of its national program, and in its analyses, it's indicated this is a revenue positive corridor. There's so much pent-up demand for service on the corridor, it actually would help offset operating losses that occur in other places. And so again, just for the commission's consideration, as council looks at this project coming through, in the council's comments, I would strongly suspect there will be a very strong statement and expectation with respect to this project moving forward, again, commensurate with other activity on this corridor. The other thing to mention is broadband access. One of the other improvements that FECI's, I guess, sister division has indicated parallel infrastructure. That's one of the 4 divisions under the company's structure. Is the installation of fairly substantial broadband fiber service, or rather capacity, if you will, in new conduit that will run from Jacksonville to Miami. That's a tremendous economic opportunity for local communities. And so Commissioner Ed Fielding, who's a commissioner in Martin County, has really been the spearhead in trying to advance discussions with parallel infrastructure to find a way for reduced cost for public users, if you will, those that would consider users that would have a public benefit, local governments, emergency service delivery, for example, educational institutions, hospitals, the biotech hubs that the state has been investing in so heavily. If those kinds of users are able to get access to this state-of-the-art broadband access, it's really a game changer with respect to telecommunications. And so this is another issue that I think you'll see council commenting on. Council's already taken several positions with respect to asking FECI to find a way to enable lower cost access for these public uses. And it creates the ability for us to have kind of smart hubs, if you will, in our communities that are along this corridor. So again, I just wanted to point these things out for the record for your consideration. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I have a question.
Sure.
You stated that the quiet zone, and clarify something
Sure.
for me. Did you say that transfers liability from the railroad to the city?
It does. That's our understanding. Trying to get a cost estimate for that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, the speed of the Amtrak back when this was originally presented, I seem to remember talking or some talk about
2008.
being a morning and a midday and an evening, so 3 or so trains, maybe more. But what would be the speed of those trains going through?
Okay, so for the record, the initial service would be a single train a day that could be expanded to 3 trains a day in each direction, and those were Amtrak's estimates as to reasonable service on the corridor. Amtrak service would run at 79 miles per hour maximum speed, which would allow a travel time of 6 hours between Jacksonville and Miami. So it's about, I guess, 2 hours or so from from Vero to Miami, and probably just under, actually, I think that's from Stewart to Miami, and I think it's about 4 hours from Stewart to Jacksonville, so about 3 hours maybe. Vero's about midpoint, really, on the corridor.
On the run from West Palm Beach, Amtrak, current train, from West Palm Beach to Jacksonville, is there any place in that run where Amtrak is doing 79 miles an hour today?
Today's service? Well, today's service, of course, runs on a different alignment. So there are 2 rail corridors in the state that carry passenger rail, right?
I know the corridor because I've taken the train.
Okay.
More than once.
Right.
I'm just listening to your comment about 79 miles an hour, and I was wondering,
Right.
any place on that corridor now that exists from West Palm to Jacksonville, is there any place that it does 79 miles an hour?
I'll check with the Amtrak folks. That's a great question. I haven't looked at it yet. I know they have a much slower run from Miami to Jacksonville because they have to go through Orlando to get there, which is pretty inefficient. And they have 32 stations between Miami and Jacksonville, and every train stops at every station. So it's a much slower line. The East Coast corridor is so attractive because there are only 6 stations between Miami and West Palm Beach. And by the way, for those of you that are familiar with this project, you may recall there was a connection necessary in West Palm Beach between the 2 tracks. It's called the Northwood Connection. It happens to be in the Northwood District in West Palm, which is around 25th Street. That's actually been funded by a Tiger grant in the last cycle, and it's actually going through the permitting process now. So that was the most expensive and slowest moving piece of the entire project. That's already been funded, and it's moving forward. So that said, there are only 6 stations between Miami and West Palm, and there are only 8 stations between including Stewart, from Stewart to St. Augustine. So many fewer stations and really some wide open conditions, going through the savannas and going through stretches of the coast that are undeveloped. I think it's fairly easy to conclude that Amtrak's time estimate of about 6 hours from Miami to Jacksonville is probably reasonable. It's a little faster than driving, a whole lot more convenient if you don't want to drive. So it's competitive with the speed of traffic, a completely different animal than the type of project that All Aboard Florida is proposing, a much faster train. I mean, they're different animals, right? Amtrak is intercity passenger rail service, runs up to 79 miles an hour, 20 to 30 mile spacing between stations. Very different than express intercity passenger service, which is All Aboard Florida's proposal, which by definition has fewer stations, faster speeds, and a higher ticket price as a result. So just to make that distinction, I will check with Amtrak. On my list of notes is case law and where are they running 79 miles an hour.
Thank you.
So no problem.
Kim,
Yes, ma'am.
can you back up to the broadband slide?
Sure. There you go.
And can you just briefly discuss that one more time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as part of the corridor improvements that FECI has proposed, and it'll all be detailed in the environmental permit, I imagine, but we've been meeting to try to understand, what's coming and where can we find some local benefit? We need to find public benefit to offset these costs. This was what my council has asked us to do. So we're trying to understand that. So access to broadband is, in the minds of many, a fairly significant public benefit. And so parallel infrastructure, which is one of the divisions within FEC, let's say, or Rail America. I can't remember the exact arrangement.
Under FECI.
Under FECI. Okay, so under Florida East Coast Industries is parallel infrastructure. And parallel infrastructure is proposing to install conduit with like 320 strands of fiber. And my math will be off, so I will clarify that for the record. So just a lot of fiber, but it's something in the neighborhood of hundreds of strands of fiber. One strand of fiber, as we understand it, could support all the data needs for Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties together. That's how much capacity exists in that kind of fiber. And so, with the installation of this broadband infrastructure, if you will, what Commissioner Fielding has brought to our council, and now our council has begun taking a more active position, is, gosh, if this project is coming to the FEC coast, we'd like to find an opportunity company to provide reduced cost access for public users. And the public users that have been identified to date are users like local governments, universities, and the K-12 system, if you will, so the educational users, the public users, including not just city hall access, but emergency service delivery and responding to hurricanes and those types of things. There's an enormous demand for public agency users, hospitals, medical care districts, real-time reading of MRIs. I mean, there's all sorts of examples that have been thrown out, doing live surgical interfaces with other entities, and biotech hubs. And that's a use that's very key from an economic development standpoint, because public agencies have invested in those hubs. It's a game changer. Scripps just had another business that opened in California because we didn't have the access we needed for them to open here. That was just an article about that, in fact, earlier this week. So this is the idea behind the broadband access opportunity, if you will, which is to find a way to provide discounted access for, again, those public users as an offsetting opportunity to the other impacts that are presented by the improvements proposed on the corridor. I hope I answered that. It was a little roundabout in that answer, I realize.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other commissioners have questions at this time? Okay, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
We appreciate it.
Sure. And my contact information is here, by the way. And of course, I'll leave this PowerPoint. It's on your hard drive now, I think. So, and I'll follow up with these points. Okay?
Thank you, Mrs. Delaney.
welcome.
Really appreciate you taking your time.
Happy to help.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Good afternoon. I don't know, you had asked for, glad to be here. Kim did a great job, so I'm not going to repeat, try to go over everything she said again. She did a great job with her explanation of quiet zones. You asked, Mr. Chairman, last week if we had any pictures of quiet zones, and I do. I don't know where they are on the computer, Jim.
Oh, that's what these are.
Sorry. Thanks.
This one's not.
Ta-da. Okay. So you. Oh, thanks so much. You had asked for some pictures of quiet zones, and so we did get some of these, and I just want to run through them because there was a discussion of raised medians before, and so these are several examples. I guess this is the first one. You see this little, here's the crossing up here, of course. This is obviously in a more industrial zone. So this little yellow curbing here is what we're talking about. A channelization barrier was the phrase that was mentioned. That's one form of a channelization barrier. And, in this case, there's a sign for the cars telling there's no train horn, so stop, look, and listen is what the idea is here. And this is another example of a similar channelization barrier again, a more of an industrial. It looks like an old train station right there, actually, in that picture, with multiple sets of tracks to keep people from crossing a road. And here's a little better example of more of a highway we might see around here, where that channelization barrier is in the middle with built by stone, a little more aesthetically pleasing. You could even go something nicer than that. But that's sort of what that looks like. And as you can see, the car that's on the right-hand side of the road, or the oncoming car in this photograph, if he's on the other side of the crossing, he's just not going to be able to turn around and try and go around the train. And I think this picture shows four quadrant gates as well, so you might have both. This picture definitely is four quadrant gates here on both sides, and that would stop the traffic. But this particular photograph has no channelization barrier. So this is the type of thing that you would have to, the engineering design would have to look at each crossing and decide what was best for that particular intersection. Here's another photo of a four quadrant gates. Looks like more of a residential, leading into a residential area. So no channelization barriers here. Here's another form. These are like delineators. There's a that would be on this road coming up to a crossing that looks like has two gates, but these delineators are more, they're softer type of protection, or some sort of signal not to go across. Actually, it's interesting. And here's another photo. There's a company, I think they're in Michigan, that actually makes these kind of delineators that come out of the ground. So they would be retracted during normal times, and when a train comes, it would go up. So you have a visual situation here. Do you want to keep looking at these all the time? And that's not the prettiest thing to look at. But there are other ways to design it that you might be more pleasant to look at in a particular area. This looks like a 4-quadrant gate area. It looks like it's snowing or something. I'm not sure what's wrong with this photograph, but those are the examples. I think that the most common examples of quiet zones in the area. Yes, sir.
I have a question on the quiet zone. They talked about the wayside horn.
Mm-hmm.
We have the bells that will continue to go off in a quiet zone. Wayside horn, that sounds also when the train comes through?
Yes, well, that's not exactly a quiet zone, because you've changed the horn from you've changed the horn from the nose of the train to a stationary horn that's facing, like in this particular photograph. If you were standing right here where the guy with the camera is, that horn is coming right at you. So it might be in the center of that intersection facing you, and it just kind of blows down the street to warn people that a train is coming.
Thank you.
Stationary. I have no formal presentation, Mr. Chairman. Beyond that, there's been a lot of great, lot of comments, a lot of good. As I said, Kim did a great job, and I'll be glad to answer whatever questions, what I can.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
For you, Mr. Roberts.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard that about time frames where, in the event that the city decides to look into the quiet zone, safety zone situation, please tell me when we would have to have everything submitted to your company. I'm looking for a month and a year that would have to be done. In other words, we have to have all our paperwork, everything in order to submit to you all. When is that? There's got to be a closing date where you take all the paperwork in.
There's got to be, and I don't even know if we know that date yet. But I'll try to get that information to you. I will tell you that we have put your city manager in touch with some folks on the engineering team with the company, so they could have a dialogue. I said at the last meeting that we would put Jim in direct contact with somebody from the company who's involved in the infrastructure operation. So that sort of takes out us as the middleman, mm-hmm. and allows him to get answers to questions and be able to direct advise the commission on what needs to be done. Kim had mentioned the field diagnostics. They are underway. They're underway in some of the southern counties, and we're moving north. So we are several weeks away from getting here, but Mr. O'Connor and his public works director will be notified when we're scheduled to be in Indian River County.
As a follow-up question, to get the information as far as the month and year that we have to have all the paperwork submitted to your company, to get us that information back to us, when do you think that would be?
Well,
in other words, to get my question answered, is it going to be like a month or 2 months? When could you bring back that information?
I'm not sure. Paperwork submitted to our company, or paperwork submitted to FRA?
As far as what we have to get going to move forward with the process. In other words, everybody's been asking, well, when do we have to have everything submitted? So if we are going to do this, we have to have all our ducks in order. So we kind of need to know some time frames. That's what I'm looking for. So when does your company have to have all the paperwork? Well, in other words, you could say an example. Gee whiz, guys! Tomorrow morning you have to submit everything. We're closing the window on you. I'm looking for a month and a year.
I'll ask. I know you'll have to submit information to the FRA. But you're asking with respect to the work that we're going to be doing in the crossing. That would allow the work that the city wants to do.
Because if we would like to, let's say, argument, it's really up to the city council. They would like to get some of these things done. It's up to them. And they're going to need to know, okay, well, your company has to have the paperwork, because you had said a few meetings ago, if the cities want to do something, they need to let you guys know, within reasonable time. But you guys have to tell us when. When is that window going to close on us? We have to know that.
try to get that the best answer. Narrow that down as close as I can for you.
Yeah, that's kind of a good answer. Kind of narrow it down as far as, so we kind of have some dates, a year and a month.
The EIS process, as was mentioned before, is underway.
Right.
There was some incorrect statements the way that process does work. We are not writing the EIS. That is being written by the Federal Railroad Administration. We are collecting the data for the EIS. So we don't write the EIS. The FRA writes it. They ask us for information. We collect data. They put it in. They publish it. At that point is when the public input meetings will be scheduled, and we'll be certainly doing one in this area where people can come and make the kind of comments that have been made here today and give their opinion, which will go into the record. And of course, after that, the Federal Railroad Administration comes out with their record of decision, which would be sometime later this year. But those meetings are not scheduled yet. It's true there's been a delay. There's several good reasons for it, but these things do take a long time. It's quite an involved and complicated project, but we expect in the next few months the draft to be submitted and get ready for those hearings.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else with
Yeah, I have
questions?
a question. The idea of channelized process to eliminate the sound of the horn, that require any technical information from the railroad? I mean, that could be added later with not much additional cost. I would assume that doesn't look
real expensive.
Doesn't really look expensive. It doesn't look like you as a railroad would have to do anything more than you're already planning to do.
Mm-hmm.
If we did that, and if that would qualify, then we wouldn't have to make that investment in case if your project does fall through. It doesn't really come in. We wouldn't have to make an advanced decision. Do a lot of engineering. We'd have an alternative to install quiet zones at a later date by just putting in the channelization process. Is my reading of this
I think you're correct. You can apply to the FRA for a quiet zone at almost any given time. It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be done prior. And the fact if that approach was taken is not really a big necessity for us to do a lot of engineering about putting additional gates up or any of that kind of stuff. There's an alternative that is not as costly as the original one we're talking about with quad gates, right?
You mean the alternatives safety measures she mentioned? Again, it depends on every crossing.
Right. One of the basic concerns I have is going 110 miles an hour through a heavily populated area with no fencing along. I mean, I've gone along a railroad. There's no fencing along that railroad. People can wander across. We just had an accident a week or so ago where a pedestrian, and we do have sidewalks going across this area. So, and my reading of it is a horn sounding is going to give no more than 15 seconds warning. If it's a half a mile out, you can calculate the distance, and the fact it's going 100 miles an hour, it takes a lot of the time off how soon you'd be hearing it. So you get about 15 seconds, and you're going to be doubling the width of the crossing because you're putting in a second line. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, our footprint is not doubled, but certainly there's two tracks to cross as opposed to one, but within the same footprint.
Right. And as far as you know,
from our property line on the east side to our property line on the west side stays the same.
Okay. We've asked earlier what fencing are you going to be putting along the lines for safety purposes?
We are going to be doing fencing. I don't know what kind it is. We obviously will be putting in something that meets the FRA safety guidelines. That has to be considered, and that's part of the diagnosis that we're doing now in terms of where the fencing will be. And as I said at the last meeting, we will be in touch with the cities that where we're working with regard to the fencing that we're putting in, and let them know.
Have you received any criteria from the regulating authority where fencing should be put in based on speed or population or any of that kind of stuff?
I'm sure we have. I'm sure the engineering team has that. I know that diagnostic review is underway right now. That's why the FRA is in the field. The convention, the FECI, All Aboard Florida, Florida DOT are in the field now, looking at all the crossings and looking at along the entire corridor.
Okay, so the decision, though, to put in fencing if required for safety purposes through populated areas, that would be at the cost of the...
That would be at our cost.
That would be your cost.
That would be at our cost.
Yep.
Mr. Hetty?
Yeah, Mr. Roberts. At a prior meeting, there was some discussion about including the fencing in selected areas, and you didn't know where those selected areas were, but you're going to get back to us. Do you have anything?
I'm in the same position I was 4 weeks ago. That
Sure.
diagnostic review is going on, Mr. Heddy,
Okay.
so we don't.
And then also, this is all from our meeting, you talked about the profile of the train itself, and that it was significantly quieter, different profile.
Yes,
and
sir.
they operate on a higher class of track. So is the high-speed train going to be on a higher class of track, regardless of where it is in that corridor from Orlando to Miami?
Well, we're doing track improvements all along the corridor where we have to that would be commensurate with the type of service we're doing.
Okay, when you talked about a higher class of track, that just led me to believe that.
I don't know. I can't remember saying that. I'm not sure what I would mean by that. But the track has to be of a grade, or the installation that would be suitable for this kind of operation.
There were some comments that the public hearings would be held in a few months. There's still no dates for any of those public hearings?
No, sir. We're waiting for the draft environmental impact statement to be published.
The progress that you're making moves forward, and all of that moves forward prior to any public hearing. It seems to me that just gives the impression that the public hearing is just to meet some.
The progress that is moving forward is planning, Mr. Heddy. I don't know what you would characterize as putting the cart before the horse, which is, I think, what you just said. We are planning. We're preparing for the draft environmental impact statement. We're doing a lot of studies. We're not under construction right now.
Mr. Roberts noted that they're a private company, and as such, privately funded, and financial statements are not required to be publicly disclosed. And we recognize what the legal requirements are, but the question still stands. In fact, the city manager at one point in the meeting said he would like to see a business model that shows how it works. Has there been any progress at all, or any change in status with regard to some financial information? Are you willing to share that yet, or no, or have you gotten an answer back from your company?
We're not willing to share that at this time, sir. The gentleman that spoke earlier that questioned the fact that we're a privately financed operation is incorrect. We are a privately financed operation. We are borrowing money. We are using our own money. If a business were to come into Vero Beach to do a startup business, and he would ask for a certificate of occupancy, I don't know that the city manager would ask for his business plan to see if he's going to be successful. He's just going to make sure he gets a CO.
I don't know that they're good analogies, but at the meeting, you said you were going to check in to see whether or not that. So you did some checking, and the answer is no. You're not willing to share any financial information.
That's correct, sir.
At the 2-3 meeting, you said that they're currently working on the safety plan. That safety plan still continues to be a work in progress?
Yes, sir.
And there were questions, and then again, a citizen asked today about the locations of where the trains pass by each other. And the significance of that, of course, is if Vero Beach, perchance, were a location where they were passing by, then that would be one pass for two trains, and maybe settle some of the concerns people have about the crossing.
They call those rolling meets. That's the term I've learned that they use in this type of thing. And obviously that will be happening in various places along the corridor. I really couldn't tell you right now where that will happen.
Okay, you said that you would get some information for that, but that hasn't happened yet then either. Okay. Mr. O'Connor said that the federal rules overrule our noise ordinance. I'm sure that your company knows and understands that. Is there a body of law such as Ms. Delaney is going to provide? Is there a body of law that you have showing case law where objections to the noise have been overruled?
I'm not aware of that. The only body of law I'm aware of is that the Federal Railroad Administration requires horns to be sounded at a certain range of decibel. That federal regulation preempts any local noise ordinance.
Okay, but you don't have any specific cases that have come before the courts that were a municipality or no?
It's not something I've researched, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Appreciate it.
And Mr. Roberts?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. On the fencing, I've had a lot of questions on fencing because I'm sure you know where the railroad is through our downtown. And my question is this: you have folks that are getting ready to go into the field to do the analysis. They'll do the analysis. Now, these folks that are doing that, do they give you feedback on what type of fencing is needed under the federal guidelines?
I think so. I don't know. I'm not sure. And I know when the team engages the city team, that would be an obvious question I'm sure that the manager would want to ask. I mean, they will be together for these diagnostic reviews, and they'll have desktop meetings as well as in the field meetings.
All right, so they'll gather the data. And what time frames are they working under? They start, at point A, and obviously with their contract, they have to be finished at a certain amount of time to get that data to where they have to go. What is that time frame?
You've clarified the question. Do you mean how long will it take to get through Vero Beach with
okay, let's just do us.
Okay.
They have to gather the information here.
I haven't spent a day with him yet. I'm hoping to spend at least a day on one of those field teams to see how they do it and how long it takes. I'm sure it is certainly not an entire day in one crossing.
Understood.
So you can probably go pretty quickly.
All right, so once they gather all the information up, for all the counties, it goes to you all. When could we find out what type of fencing, there was terms that were put out there, a sealed corridor. People want to know, well, where is the fencing going to go? There's some residents that are around our tracks. They want to know, okay, how high is the fence going to be? All those kind of questions.
Well, I appreciate the fact that everybody wants a lot of answers quickly, want to know a lot of this information as quickly as possible. We do too. We're having to work through this process and get these answers ourselves.
Okay.
And if I may say, we have tried to be as open as transparent as possible where we can. Obviously, we're not satisfying every question that we answer, but I've been at this meeting voluntarily every week.
Thank you.
We voluntarily go to every city commission that's asked, and I've just been to about every one now, and try and give information as we know it, as quickly as we know it. But it's a process that takes time, and we. As I said, when we finish these diagnostic reviews, we will be sitting down with the city staff, and so as we go along, I think people will be happy with the progress, and they'll be much more informed. And I think being informed is what's going to help people understand that this project is going to have a positive impact on this whole state, and some of the concerns that people have with that they're expressing, especially with crossings, they will find that it's not as great as they presupposed.
Right. This community, Vero Beach City, and even some of our county friends, we ask a lot of questions. They like to get the answers. They want to know what's going on. They want to know how it's going to affect their quality of life. We had a very good turnout at that little get-together that I spoke about a little while ago, and that's why we put up some of those concerns. And you noticed a lot of concerns that came in here today are similar. And, the commissioners I know individually have been approached. People do want answers. And with that being said, I'd like to say thank you very much to you for coming. You're our guest, and I really do appreciate you coming in. And I know some of the questions are a little hard and awkward, but I do appreciate you being so.
I don't mind. It toughens
fair.
Me up, so that's okay.
Thank
I just
you.
want to say that
I appreciate you coming.
Ms. Delaney mentioned Amtrak, and pent-up demand, I think was the phrase. And this is something we just didn't make up. I mean, there is pent-up demand for alternative transportation in the state. And let me just make one other point. Florida is about to become the third largest state.
That's correct, third largest.
And we can only build so many lane miles of traffic. And so projects like this will have far-reaching effects on the people's mobility in the state and the economy of the state. And we're not opposed to offering additional stops after we get this initial leg built. This is something we hope that will be a benefit along the entire corridor. And Amtrak, when it's been being discussed, I just want to make note that the city of Vero Beach voted in favor. The commission voted in favor of an Amtrak stop, and most of the other cities along the corridor. And if Amtrak and All Aboard Florida are operating together, I think that's a great way for people to connect, to change from one service to another and go longer distances or go somewhere else. So just want to make that point. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And what Mr. Roberts was referring to a little while ago about the state, I think probably within the next 2 to 3 years, the Florida state's going to become the third largest populated state in the country.
That's correct.
Mr. Roberts, one last thing. I'm sure you have this, and if you don't, I'd be happy to give you mine. But the Downtown Association came up with some bullet points. Is there a way that you can take a copy of this and come back to the next meeting with your comments on any one of those things that you want to address, so that the Main Street Association can hear your answers to some of these concerns?
We'll be happy to provide those questions in answers to those questions as best we can, and I think we will do that in writing, except I will tell you I take offense to somebody questioning my integrity, bullet point number 5. Other than that, I'm happy to do it.
And please ignore those ones. That's fine. But I think that if we could get something back, and some of those are not really questions, so I understand there's nothing that you're going to, but...
No, they're good comments because, it's part of being informed.
Right.
And so
to the extent that you can, if you could bring something back, then that might help the downtown associations.
Sure, we'll be happy to.
Appreciate it.
Ms. Chandler has a question.
I have
Yes, ma'am.
a question. In the comments all along, you've said that it would be more cost effective, more efficient for the city to come in and tell you what kind of improvements the city might want sooner rather than later. And then I just heard you say that maybe down the road there would be the opportunity for stops after the system is up and running. I'm curious as to why it would be more cost effective to let you know what improvements, safety or quiet zone improvements, could be made and could be requested by the city, but that has to happen now. But if there were to be a request for a stop, that would have to happen later. Why wouldn't that be more cost effective to happen now?
To put a stop in now and
Right.
while we're building it. I think it was Mr. Gruber, somebody mentioned in the morning comments about everything we're going to do has based on a business plan, and we looked at the system that is designed, we looked at the ridership opportunities, we looked at the marketing opportunities, and we decided that, and we looked at the investment, the budget that we had to provide. We looked at it as this system being the best system to start us up, and that is where the most of the riders are right now in those 3 cities in South Florida and in Orlando. Somebody mentioned 50 million people. It's not 50 million people. It's 50 million trips, and we did. I mentioned this in my first presentation, an investment-grade ridership study that was peer-reviewed to show that our study was valid. And that showed 50 million trips between South Florida and Central Florida every year. Actually, I will tell you, a lot of people say, I don't believe that. 500 million trips between South Florida and Central Florida every year, but we narrowed that down to 50 million trips of people that would be living or operating or doing business within the vicinity of our stations, say a 20-minute vicinity of our station. So that does include tourists. A huge part of our market is going to be tourists, but we're going to have also a fairly substantial local market that will grow, starting with business travel and people who want to just travel up to another city and visit for a few hours and head back. So we think that local service will grow, but our main market is the tourism industry, and the two tourist centers of the state are Orlando and Miami.
Right. That's one of our missions too, is the
Mm-hmm.
tourism industry. So I'm wondering, are you going to be able to provide us with what that process will be to request that down the road, someplace, we have a station? Are you going to be able to tell us before this is all completed what that process would be?
Oh, sure. I mean, let us get up and running. I'm sure we'd be happy to be talking to you before the first train rolls down the track. But we've got to make this a success, because if it's not a success, then there's no point in talking about any other station location anywhere in Florida, and that includes any Amtrak service, because we have to. We're trying to make the highest, best use of this corridor. And again, it's a private venture, but we are serving, I think, a good public service.
And with that being said, there was talk about a business plan. A few meetings ago, your company, I know, did a business plan, and it was submitted to a group to take a look at your business plan to check the analysis. Then wasn't there another group to check the analysis again? And basically, you have a pretty sound plan, is what you were...
I think I was referring to the ridership study.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Is that something that we had?
You have a date on that first train rolling by?
No, sir, I don't. We're hoping for have service early 2016. If I give you a date, we won't be able to keep the date.
That's you just did, early 2016. Thank you.
Yeah.
And was the ridership study, was that something available to us?
I've never even seen the ridership study. It was done before I joined the company, but I'll check on that. I don't know.
That'd be great.
Okay, go ahead.
If I recall, your original presentation on ridership was that about half or more of the riders would come from organized tour groups rather than individual tours. Is that true?
A large percentage. I don't think the figure was half, but
it was close to half.
30 something percent.
Yeah, but anyway, it was primarily. You say you were tourists that were the organized tour groups, and there were the individual tourists.
Yeah,
made up more
traveling.
than half.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Mr. Roberts. One more question? Go ahead.
No, just a point of clarification. It's Main Street Vero Beach instead of Main Street Association.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Mr.
very much.
Roberts.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming. All right, Mr. City Manager, you're up.
Mr. Chairman, most of everything I would ever say has already been said today, except that we do have some information. As Rusty indicated, he has sent us some contact people with engineers. We have gotten an estimate. It's $20,000 to $30,000 to do just a survey of the connections that we would have, and that's just to do the survey and to sort of take a quick overview of that. But we also will continue to monitor and work in that direction. But Monty has sort of been the warehouse of information, and maybe he can sort of address the commission himself. And
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Falls.
Yep, Monty Falls, Director of Public Works. What I just passed out was some information that we received from Trans Systems, Inc. It's one of the consulting groups that are working on the project. Mr. Roberts shared their contact information with us. Joe Masterson, the engineer in charge, was kind enough to spend some time with me on the phone and send me this. Most of this stuff kind of just backs up information you've already seen today, but it'll give you something you can have in your hand to take a look at that shows you the quad gates and the channelization and talks about some of the things that you've had today. But Mr. Masterson did share to me the typical process that a local community goes through when they're looking at a quiet zone is three-phase. It's the study first, then you select from that study what you want for each location. The design is then done, plans prepared, and then construction is done. And he said that total process could be anywhere from 18 months to 2 years, with the study taking between 3 and 6 months. And he said these are just his experience and timeframes for the way that he has seen that happen in the past.
Okay, questions?
We're talking about a $20,000 expenditure to do an 18-month study about whether or not we could make an investment that we're going to be required to make a decision on within 12 months.
20 to 30,000 for a study. The time frame would take 3 to 6 months.
3 to 6 months. Well, where do the 18 months come in?
The 18 months to 2 years would be the total 3-phase study, design, and construction.
Study, design, and construction. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. When do you think a study like this should start? You know, with what's going on now, you've heard all the discussions. Because you're going to have to.
I think after the environmental impact statement,
okay,
is once we get a chance to see kind of what that says, it'll give us an idea of where we are in the total process, and then we can make some decisions from there. Would be my recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Monty.
Any other questions for Mr. Falls? Okay. All right, we're to number 7, members' matters. Ms. Chandler, you're up.
I had sent Tammy, and she sent out the memo that I had gotten from the county in regard to where they were. So you all have that. That was a memo from Chris Mora that went to the commissioners, looking at where they might benefit from any quiet zones or any other improvements. And it really doesn't appear that that much is happening there right now, except that they're just watching it. The other thing that I thought was interesting that I found when I was searching around on the internet, Olska Forbes and I had a conversation about costs. And I know that different times during these meetings, it has come up, you know, how much do these improvements cost? And we've asked Mr. Roberts and so on and so forth, how much would the improvements for quiet zone or safety, that kind of thing, cost? I found a report that was a final report that was prepared for the Downtown Development Authority in Fort Collins, Colorado, and it was they commissioned a study to be done on quiet zones and make recommendations. And I sent that, you all received a copy, and that it's a 55-page report that looked at their 12 highway crossings that were located within the city. And, you know, it's really not a scope that's different than what we're looking at. It did the inventory, it looked at the current conditions, it compared alternatives for safety and quiet zone measures. And one of the things that I thought that was interesting that came up today that was discussed, I think, by Kim, and then you asked a question about the horns and what kinds of horns. On page 20 and 21 of that study report, it shows the footprint of the horn, a regular train horn compared to the noise footprint for a wayside horn. So I thought that was something that we really should be looking at, because that's very different when you look at that footprint.
In that report, Penny, what was the speed? 35, I think.
The speed was it was higher than that. I think it was.
My recollection, it was a slow train going through Fort Collins.
It's slower than 110, but it wasn't as low as 35. I think it was.
It's in there.
Midway,
I don't have it in front of me.
It was in there. And then the look at alternatives, and that included like pedestrian crossings and those kinds of things. But I thought something that was very telling for us was the final page of the document gave a comparison for all of the improvements that could be done, talked about the level of costs for each option, and then it laid out what each option would be. So I think that was really, could give us, and this was done a couple of years ago, I think that really could give us some indication of what kind of costs we're talking about. And almost everything where they did any major improvements and quiet zones where they were talking about the level of costs, most all of that was well over $100,000, almost approaching $400,000 on some of the options. One of the things, and maybe Mr. Roberts, maybe you could help with this. I didn't read all 55 pages. I looked through it, but they talked about one option called a CWT circulatory. What's that? Do you know? Do you know, Kim?
Must be constant warning time. That's the only acronym I've seen like that.
Okay, that makes sense.
But I don't know what the other adjective means.
Ken, could you just repeat that so that the public?
Kim, come up and
I'm sorry. Yeah, I
Constant
apologize.
warning time.
Sorry. They can't hear you over there.
Sorry about that. I'll use my mommy voice from back there.
Thank you.
It must be constant warning time, which is the only acronym I've seen. And we've also reviewed the Town of Windsor application and Tiger Grant application. They were awarded $2.6 million. It's the first Tiger Grant that's been awarded for quiet zones. I've actually been on the phone with the town manager, and we're using that as a model
Windsor?
for the region. Windsor, Colorado, which is
okay.
kind of an exclusive Colorado exclusive community in Colorado. Okay. Very different condition, going from I think 4 trains a day to 12, and the trains move about 35 miles an hour. So the bar necessary, if you will, to raise the safety rating to establish a quiet zone in that condition is considerably different than either the today condition that we have on the corridor, which is like 18 freight trains a day, and the tomorrow condition, which is 18 plus 32. So it's, but we're trying to use it as a precedent, and I've also been on the phone with the FRA staff to confirm it is a reasonable precedent. There are a number of communities.
Have you seen this one?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yep. So a number of communities using that as the model to seek Tiger grants. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Anyone else with questions? Question from Mr. Falls, please. The study that Ms. Chandler was referring to, do you have that study?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you're up, Mr. Cortell.
Thank you. I just got back from a month's trip to Asia, where I was riding on high-speed trains, and I noticed that in almost all cases they're elevated, and in almost all cases they are totally the track is protected. It's enclosed so that people can't walk. You just can't get to the track because when a train's starting to go 100 miles an hour, your time, reaction time, either the stopping distance, all of those kinds of things are of significant safety issues. And putting a train at that speed through a heavily populated area, which I think we classify as, raises, in my mind, that we might be talking more about safety issues and making comments to any EIS study that's going on about our concerns that putting a train at 110 miles an hour through a populated area is not necessarily the wisest thing for government to allow. And speed limits are established for a lot of reasons on roads and what have you. And I would like to, I would get a little concerned about all of the discussions about the fact that the railroads are here first and therefore they have some sort of sovereignty rights over their right of way. And that's why I raised questions about that maybe we ought to consider changing that, because as the local government, where a private firm is going to triple the amount of traffic going through, double the size of the right-of-way, and more than double the speed at which they go through, to me is an impact on our quality of life within this community and all the other communities going down. And I think we ought to be focused. Quiet zones, to me, is important because it will affect our quality of life. I'm more concerned about a 110-mile-an-hour train going through our community unless it is totally protected from people being able to get on that track anywhere along that. And I would like to have some more discussions about that, which is why I asked the questions about the fencing. And maybe, and if you fence the whole thing and make it impossible for people to get on there, the issue of quiet zones becomes, it's probably a lot easier to establish a quiet zone if you've taken those stages. Also, in the EIS, it may be that the question of speed limit will come up, and that a train will not be allowed to go through a community at a speed above a certain amount unless certain things are put in by the railroad. It should not be a community's responsibility to protect their public safety from a private enterprise that is changing their use of their right-of-way. And I think that's the concern I would have in the discussions. I would like to get some discussions along those lines going forward.
What kind of fencing did they have? What did it look like?
They had fairly high fencing, and there were, when the train was elevated and there were no crossings, it was going at a high speed. When it entered the populated area and had to get down, it slowed down dramatically when it went down to grade, and where there were some grade crossings, and there were fences along the whole way. We put in our interstate highway system, for example. They are fenced all along the highway system. If you know, the interstate highway has fences all the way along it, and they are probably further wet than they need to be. But there's a reason for that.
Are they chain linked, or are they like pieces of metal? You know, what do they look
they're
like?
all basically chain link fences.
All chain link?
Yeah.
And you had said the fencing is higher than the train?
No, it's higher than it's not over the train. It's just something. It's about 6 feet.
A 6 foot high chain link fence.
Chain link fence is basically the fencing that they require, so that people can't easily climb over it. It would have to be an effort in order to get on the track. But that's something we ought to be. So I've been asking those questions, and I think it's something that I'd like to know what the criteria is, and if that's a decision not being made by FEC, but being made by federal regulatory agency or what have you, that's an issue where we have to bring it up there. I think we should be prepared when the EIS hearings are held, when we have the public comment on EIS, to make sure that these concerns and questions are addressed properly, because I think the environmental impact on our community is going to be significant. I'm not opposed to railroads. I'd love to have a railroad stop here. There's no question about that. The speed limit gets automatically adjusted if you have a stop, because if the train's stopping, it's going to slow down before it gets there. It's going to take a while to speed up. But in between, the trains that are not going to stop here, that's where I think there's going to be some issues in terms of speed limits that maybe FEC has thought about, maybe they haven't. But that's something I think we should be focusing on.
And thank you very much for that report. It's very helpful. The speed issue through our downtown area, we had at our meeting or get-together, there were a lot of concerns with the speed coming through our downtown. We had what we call stakeholders. They own property. They've worked real hard to get their properties up and running in the last number of years. Everybody knows about the economic downturn. So the speed issue, we're going to have to address that pretty soon so it gets incorporated into the study. I'm going to ask the commission members to really start thinking about some type of language we would like to put together as a commission that we could forward to the city council and make our recommendations so it's incorporated into this study, because it will take some time for them to mull it around. They may want to put some of their thoughts in it, but then we can forward it to this EIS study. So the next meeting, when you all come together again, I'm going to be asking for some of your input and looking to send something off to council. So please be prepared. Mr. Hetty, do you have anything you would like to share? Mrs. Avery?
I'm fine.
So we're done. Okay, I'll entertain a motion for closing.
So moved.
Okay, we're done. Thank you.